Scott Bessent is celebrating what he calls a major breakthrough in trade negotiations between the United States and China. According to him, he saved America from a tariff war with rates of 100%. But behind the loud headlines and photos against the backdrop of flags, something does not add up. The deal he is so proud of may not be a sign of strength, but a troubling signal. The White House claims that there is now a solid framework agreement designed to restore balance between the world's two largest economies. But on closer inspection, this framework stands on shaky ground. It rests on only 3 pillars: tariffs, soybeans, and rare earth metals. And these will determine who actually holds the power. While markets rejoice and Bessent enjoys his moment of glory, questions are mounting. What did Washington really concede for the sake of this appearance of success? And can the agreement truly protect an economy already strained by inflation, rising prices, and debt? Scott Bessent stated that the United States reached a highly significant framework agreement with China that supposedly prevented a new 100% tariff war. On paper, it sounds like a victory. The tariff explosion has been averted, farmers have been promised relief, trade appears to be balanced again. But behind this optimism lies a question. What did Washington pay for this illusion of stability? It is not a full-fledged trade agreement, but a fragile arrangement built on 3 pillars. The first is tariffs. Trump's threat to impose additional 100% duties on Chinese goods forced Beijing back to the negotiating table. The second is American farmers, who were on the verge of collapse after China completely stopped buying soybeans, forcing Washington to promise subsidies and push for renewed purchases. The third is rare earth metals, essential for the production of everything from smartphones to fighter jets. The United States is seeking for China to postpone export restrictions for at least a year to avoid supply disruptions. According to Bessent, Beijing agreed to both conditions: to resume purchases of American soybeans and to temporarily freeze restrictions on rare earth exports. In return, Trump is suspending his plan for 100% tariffs. On paper, it looks like a clean victory for Washington, a long-awaited respite after months of chaos. But the details of the deal are classified, and no one knows exactly what had to be sacrificed to achieve this success. Bessent's confidence soothes the markets, but beneath the surface, anxiety is growing. The U.S. economy is fragile, inflation remains high, and public patience is wearing thin. The main question is whether this framework can withstand the pressure of reality. Beneath its shiny exterior, the American economy is literally crumbling. The Consumer Sentiment Index has fallen to a 5-month low, and current assessments of economic conditions have dropped to multi-year lows. Inflation expectations have risen again from 3.7 to 3.9% for the next 5 to 10 years. People no longer believe that prices will ever return to normal. The availability of goods and services has fallen back to 2022 levels, when the cost of living crisis was just beginning to unfold. Ordinary Americans feel pressure everywhere. Food, rent, and fuel are rising faster than wages, and the tariff war only adds fuel to the fire. Yes, it hits Chinese exporters, but at the same time, it raises prices in the United States. Every day, the country imports more than $1 billion worth of goods from China. Doubling tariffs on such volumes will cause a sharp rise in retail prices and make inflation unmanageable. The U.S. economy runs on consumption. When prices rise, spending falls, and confidence collapses. People are already cutting back on major purchases, and their savings are shrinking. Production costs are also increasing as imported components become more expensive. All this triggers a vicious cycle of rising costs and declining demand. Behind the political theater of tariff threats lies a simple truth: America cannot raise prices on everything it imports without hurting itself. Each new duty undermines consumer confidence and fuels inflation expectations. That is why Washington is desperately trying to hold on to the current agreement. The longer the trade war drags on, the more vulnerable the American economy becomes. While the United States struggles with inflation and growing debt, Beijing has much more room to maneuver. The share of Chinese exports that goes to the U.S. is significant but far from critical. Global demand for Chinese goods continues to rise. Over the past 12 months, China's total exports have approached $4 trillion. Even if trade with America were to stop completely, the losses would amount to only about 2.5% of GDP, perhaps even less. For Beijing, that is endurance. For Washington, it is pressure. Besant is confident that China will soon resume purchases of American soybeans, calling it a huge relief for Midwest farmers. But for the farmers themselves, this crisis is no cause for joy. U.S. soybean exports to China have already fallen to zero. Warehouses are full, and farms are teetering on the brink of bankruptcy. Even during the 2018 to 2019 trade war, China bought around 1.5 million tons per year. Today, the flow has stopped entirely. The Trump administration has already planned a $10 billion aid package to prevent mass bankruptcies in the agricultural sector. But subsidies cannot cover the gap forever. They only delay the inevitable. If China does not return to the market, the agricultural crisis will become one of the most painful consequences of Besant's so-called Great Deal. Besant's optimism depends entirely on whether Beijing decides to reverse course. For that to happen, China would have to lift its 10% tariff on American soybeans, meaning it would forgo about $12 billion in tariff revenues. That is not an easy decision. Removing the tariff would also mean cutting purchases from Brazil and Argentina, the countries that now dominate its soybean market. Brazil alone supplies more than 70% of all soybeans imported by China and has become its main agricultural partner. If Beijing does resume purchases of American soybeans, it will not be an act of goodwill. It will be a calculated move to gain leverage in other areas: technology, finance, or export regulations. There is also a purely economic motive. In October, American soybeans were about $90 per ton cheaper than Brazilian ones, roughly 1.2% more profitable for large shipments. But even with that discount, the 10% tariff makes U.S. supplies uncompetitive. If China cancels it, that would effectively remove duties on about $12 billion of U.S. imports. A short-term resumption of trade may appear to be a diplomatic victory for Washington, but behind it could lie concessions that remain undisclosed. For now, the hope of renewed Chinese demand is the only thing keeping many farmers from collapse. If purchases do not resume soon, Besant's promised soybean revival will turn into yet another political illusion, leaving behind real economic pain. It is rare earth metals, however, that give China its true lever of power. Today, 70% of rare earth imports to the United States still come from China, and for certain elements such as scandium and yttrium, the dependency is 100%. That is why Besant insisted that Beijing postpone its export restrictions for at least 1 year. This was meant to give Washington a breathing space, but 1 year is a negligible period for a sector like supply chains. Developing new deposits takes years, and building and launching processing plants takes even longer. In reality, this pause gives the U.S. only enough time to start panic buying. It is expected that Washington and its allies will begin actively building strategic reserves of rare earth metals to protect their industries. The problem is that China does not just mine these materials, it processes them. China accounts for 60% of global production, but as much as 91% of global processing capacity. For comparison, Malaysia, the second largest processor, controls only 4% of the market. The gap is enormous, and closing it quickly is impossible. It would take years, billions in investment, and technological expertise that the U.S. currently lacks. Yes, Washington is actively signing new agreements with Malaysia, Australia, and Vietnam, but China cannot be replaced overnight. Bringing new mines and plants online will take between 5 and 10 years, so even if Beijing temporarily delays its restrictions, real control will still remain with China. The U.S. can talk as much as it wants about diversification, but the vital artery of rare earth supply still runs through China. China is building a multipolar world through trade and infrastructure, while America is increasingly turning inward, trying to hide behind tariff walls. Every new deal now is just a short pause in a much longer game for economic survival. So was this really a trade victory, or a quiet retreat by America from its own tariff war? Share your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to like and subscribe. See you in the next episode.